3 words. I spent 6 weeks planning my husband's 40th birthday party, and I want you to understand that I am not, by nature, a woman who does things halfway. When I love someone, I love them with my whole chest, and I had loved Daniel for 14 years, the way you love a house you built with your own hands. One nail at a time, one bad year survived after another. So when my father passed and left me an inheritance of $52 million, cleared through probate after months of paperwork, I hid in a locked drawer in my office. I didn't think about vacations or cars or any of the things people imagine you'd buy with that kind of money. I thought about Daniel's face. I thought about handing him a check with his name on it, in front of everyone who had ever doubted whether a boy from a 2-bedroom rental in Ohio could really build the life he'd built. I wanted to be the one who put a crown on his head. I didn't know yet that I was about to become the punchline of my own fairy tale. The morning of the party, I stood in my closet for 20 minutes, deciding what to wear, which is unlike me. But I wanted to remember what I looked like on the best night of my marriage. I chose a green dress because Daniel once told me green was the color of luck, back when we were 26 and broke and splitting a $6 pizza in his studio apartment, and I thought there was something poetic about wearing luck on the night I gave him more of it than either of us had ever imagined. My sister Rachel came over early to help me set up the backyard, stringing lights through the maple trees, while I fussed over table linens, and every few minutes she'd catch my eye and grin, because she was the only person besides my lawyer who knew what was hiding in the cream envelope inside my clutch. I kept thinking, while I got ready, about the early years, the ones nobody throws parties for. I thought about the winter. We couldn't afford to keep the heat past 62 degrees and slept in sweatshirts, laughing about it because we were young enough to think hardship was romantic if you were doing it together. I thought about the night he studied for the bar exam at our kitchen table until 4 a.m, and I sat across from him, quizzing him with flashcards. I didn't fully understand myself, just so he wouldn't be alone with the fear of failing. I thought about how he cried, actually cried, the day he made partner, and how I cried too, not because of the title, but because I had watched him claw his way there, one exhausted year at a time, watched him become a man who no longer flinched when a waiter handed him the check. 14 years is a long time to build trust, brick by brick. I didn't think a person could dismantle it with one sentence, whispered by a stranger at a party I had spent 6 weeks planning in his honor. By 7, the yard was full. 90 people, string lights, swaying in a breeze that smelled like someone's neighbor grilling something several yards over. A jazz trio Daniel had once mentioned he loved but never let himself hire for anything. Because that was Daniel, always denying himself the good things until someone else insisted. I had a 4-tier cake in the kitchen, from the bakery he drove past every single day and never once walked into. I had a speech memorized so thoroughly I could have recited it in my sleep, and some nights that week, I think I did. It started with 14 years ago. I married a man who never once made me feel like I had to prove I belonged with him. And it ended with me handing him that envelope and telling him it was his turn to feel like the luckiest man alive. I was walking toward the little stage we'd rented, the envelope warm in my hand, my heart going so fast I could feel it in my throat, when a man in a gray suit stepped directly into my path. I recognized him faintly. Preston Hale, an attorney Daniel had used for contract work a few times. A quiet, careful man who always looked slightly out of place at parties. Like he'd rather be anywhere reading a document line by line. He touched my elbow, gentle, almost apologetic, and leaned close enough that his voice slipped under the music instead of over it. "Ma'am, I need to tell you something, and I need you to not react out here," he said. I remember thinking, in that half second before he spoke again, that this was probably nothing. Probably some small business thing, probably not worth the tightness suddenly gathering in my stomach. I have replayed that half second more times than I can count. That last sliver of my life, where I still believed the story I was living inside of was true. "Your divorce was finalized 4 months ago, ma'am. I filed the paperwork myself. I heard him the way you hear something from underwater. Muffled and delayed and completely wrong, like language had briefly stopped meaning anything. I asked him to say it again, and he did, slower, the way you'd talk to someone standing too close to a ledge. He told me Daniel had come to him in March and said the marriage was over, said I had agreed to keep it quiet until he was ready to tell people, said he'd assumed I already knew, right up until the moment he watched me walk toward a stage with an envelope in my hand, and a number on it large enough that Daniel had once asked him, weeks earlier, whether money inherited after a marriage was already legally over would count as separate property. I stood there for 3 seconds. I know it was 3 because I counted them. The way you count during a car accident, the way your brain reaches for something small and stupid to hold on to instead of this enormous thing actually happening to you. 1. The jazz trio kept playing, unaware. 2. Somewhere behind me, Rachel laughed at something, bright and easy, still living in the world where my marriage was real. 3. The string lights swayed, and somewhere in my chest, 14 years folded up like a piece of paper, and I understood, all at once, that I had been planning a surprise party for a man who had already left the marriage in every legal sense, and simply hadn't bothered to mention it to the one person it belonged to. I don't remember deciding to turn around. I remember only that my body did it before my mind caught up. The way you pull your hand off a stove before you've consciously registered the heat. I walked back through the crowd, past people who smiled at me, past a woman I barely knew who touched my arm, and said what a beautiful night, toward the stage where Daniel stood laughing with his old roommate Mark, a beer sweating in his hand, utterly unaware that the ground under him had just cracked open. I said 3 words to him. I didn't plan them. They arrived the way true things sometimes do, without asking permission. "We're done here." His laugh died mid-breath. "Sarah, what?" he started, and I watched confusion move across his face like weather, like he genuinely didn't understand yet what I already knew. "We're done here," I said again, louder this time, because the trio had just finished a song, and there was a gap of silence waiting to swallow my voice at whole. "You divorced me in March. Preston just told me. So there's nothing here for you to open." I held up the envelope, so the people closest to us could see it. The ones whose faces I would later realize I couldn't remember. Because I wasn't really looking at any of them. I was looking at 14 years, leaving my body all at once. Then I put it back in my clutch, and snapped it shut, and I walked toward the side gate where the caterers had been coming and going all night. And I did not run. I want you to understand that. I did not run even though every cell in me wanted to. I walked the way you walk out of a movie you already know the ending of, and I heard Daniel call my name twice before I heard Rachel's voice tell him, quietly, to leave me alone. I sat in my car in the driveway of a house I had, 1 hour earlier, believed was still half mine. And I called my father's estate attorney, a woman named Denise Okafor, because I did not know who else to call, and because some part of me already understood that this was no longer a marriage problem. It was a legal one. She picked up on the second ring, even though it was late, even though I had never once called her outside business hours in the 3 years I'd known her, and I think she understood immediately, from the sound of my breathing alone, that something had broken. "He filed in March," I said. "I never got papers. I never signed a single thing." "Then, whatever he filed isn't valid. Or he did something with the paperwork that's about to become a very serious problem for him," she said. "Sarah, listen to me. Don't say anything else to him tonight. Don't sign anything. Come to my office first thing tomorrow and bring every document you can get your hands on. Tonight, just breathe." I didn't breathe. Not really. Not for a long time. I drove to Rachel's apartment instead of home, because home had stopped being a word I trusted, and she opened the door still in her party dress, mascara already smudged down her cheeks from crying on my behalf, before I had even found the tears for myself, and she pulled me inside without asking me a single question, which was the only thing I needed from anyone that night. I didn't cry until almost 2 in the morning. I remember sitting on her couch in the green dress I'd chosen because Daniel once called green the color of luck, still in my heels, staring at a mug of tea going cold in my hands, and Rachel just sat next to me, not talking, not filling the silence with anything, occasionally reaching over to squeeze my knee. When it finally came, it didn't come as tears, so much as a kind of collapse, my whole body folding forward like something had been holding me upright by force, and had simply stopped. Rachel didn't tell me it would be okay. She didn't tell me I deserved better, or that Daniel was a monster, or any of the things people say when they don't know what else to say. She just held onto my arm and said, "I'm not going anywhere," and somehow that was the only sentence that actually reached me that night, because everything else felt like it was happening to someone else, some other woman whose husband hadn't quietly erased her from his own life without so much as a phone call. I didn't sleep. I lay on Rachel's pull-out couch, replaying the last year in reverse, searching for the moment I should have known, the way you always do after something like this. The conference in Denver, the new gym membership he'd gotten in February and never once invited me to join. The way he'd started keeping his phone face down on the counter, something so small I hadn't even registered it as strange, until I was lying there at 3 in the morning, turning it over like a coin, looking for the side of it that had always been there. It took Denise 9 days to piece together the full picture, and when she finally sat me down across her desk, with a folder 3 inches thick, she told me it was worse than either of us had first imagined. Daniel had filed for divorce in March, using an address that wasn't our home, a rented mailbox 2 towns over, and had told the court I couldn't be located for service, which let him move forward through publication, a legal notice buried in the classifieds of a newspaper nobody I knew had ever read. He'd used a different lawyer than Preston for the actual filing. Someone young and inexperienced, who hadn't asked the questions that should have been asked. The divorce had gone through uncontested, because as far as the court was concerned, I had never been notified. And I had never had the chance to respond, because I had never known there was anything to respond to. "He knew your father's estate was close to settling," Denise said. "He knew the number. And he wanted that inheritance classified as separate property, received after the marriage had already legally ended, so you'd have no claim to any of it. And so, he'd have grounds to argue. You weren't entitled to anything he built during the marriage either, since on paper, you two hadn't been married in months. It's fraud on the court, Sarah. We can get it vacated. But I need you to see the rest of this before we go any further. There was more, and I want to be honest with you about how it felt to see it. Because I think that's the part people skip when they tell stories like mine. The part where you sit in a leather chair in a lawyer's office, and watch the last pieces of your understanding of your own life get laid out on a desk like evidence. Because that's exactly what they are. Denise had pulled Daniel's credit card statements through Discovery and found months of charges at a boutique hotel 40 minutes outside the city. Starting in January, 3 months before he ever filed, a woman named Kayla Bishop, 29 years old, a paralegal at his firm, someone I had met twice at office holiday parties and thought was sweet, had been printed and clipped into that folder in photographs pulled from her own social media. The two of them at a lake house in the spring, his hand on the small of her back at an outdoor concert in June. The same week he told me he was in Denver for a conference. I remember I had sent him a care package to that hotel that week. Cough drops, because he'd told me he had a cold. I looked at those photographs longer than I probably should have. Not because I doubted them, but because some old, stubborn part of me kept waiting for them to rearrange themselves into something less true. They didn't. I closed the folder gently, the way you close something fragile, and I asked Denise one question, because I had already cried every tear I had access to that week, and what was left in me by then wasn't grief anymore, it was resolve. How fast can we vacate this divorce and file the real one, the one where I actually get what I'm owed? Faster than you'd think, she said. Fraudulent service is exactly the kind of thing judges hate most. And Sarah, once this gets vacated, that inheritance was legally received while you were still married. Every cent of it stays yours as separate property under your father's trust, untouched. But everything Daniel tried to shield by faking that timeline, his equity in the firm, the house, the retirement accounts, all of it comes back onto the table as marital property. He tried to get ahead of your money, and instead he just handed you the receipts to take everything else. The hearing happened 3 months later. I wore a plain navy suit and sat, with my hands folded while Judge Petrosky, a sharp-eyed woman who read through Denise's motion without a single wasted movement, looked over her glasses at Daniel's attorney and asked him, plainly, how a divorce filing by publication could possibly be justified when his client's wife had been living in their marital home the entire time, working the same job she'd held for 6 years, listed under her own name in the phone directory. I'm having a very hard time understanding how she couldn't be located, the judge said, and then she vacated the divorce on the spot, restored our marriage as a matter of legal record, and set a new date for a real proceeding, the kind where both sides have to actually show each other everything. Daniel tried to talk to me in the hallway afterward. He looked thinner than I remembered, his suit hanging a little loose on him, and there is a version of me, buried somewhere under everything that had happened, that almost felt sorry for him in that moment, because I had loved him for 14 years, and some kinds of love don't disappear just because you finally see the truth. I panicked, he said. When I found out about the inheritance, I panicked, and I did something stupid, and I know that. But Sarah, we had 14 good years before this. Doesn't that count for something? It counted for something right up until you decided a classified ad in a newspaper. Nobody reads, was an acceptable way to end a marriage without telling your wife, I said. You didn't panic, Daniel. Panic doesn't rent a mailbox 2 towns over. Panic doesn't hire a junior associate, specifically because he won't ask the right questions. That takes weeks of planning. You planned to erase me quietly so you could keep everything, so I'd never even know to look for it. The only thing you didn't plan for was your own friend not getting the memo in time to let you finish the job. He didn't have an answer for that. And for the first time in 14 years, I didn't wait around to see if he'd find one. The real divorce took another 8 months. and by the end of it I walked away with half of everything built during our marriage, including a stake in his firm that his partners were not thrilled to discover, was suddenly mine to negotiate around. I kept every cent of the inheritance untouched, exactly as my father intended, and I used part of it to buy out my half of the house, mostly because Rachel had once told me she loved that kitchen more than any kitchen she'd ever stood in, and I decided she deserved it. More than Daniel deserved to keep pretending nothing had ever happened inside those walls. I heard, eventually, through the small and slightly cruel network of people who had been at that party, that Daniel's firm let him go about a year later. After two partners quietly recused themselves from cases where his judgment had come under review, I heard Kayla left him. Not long after the settlement became common knowledge, among people we used to call friends, apparently, under the impression he'd been considerably wealthier than the final numbers revealed him to be. I won't pretend I didn't feel something when I heard that. I'm human. But it wasn't triumph, not really. It was more like watching a house you used to live in get demolished from a safe distance, feeling the strange ache of recognizing the wreckage. I used part of the inheritance to open a small architecture firm. With two former colleagues, something I had wanted for a decade and always set aside for his career, his hours, his priorities. The way you set aside a whole life for someone without ever quite noticing you're doing it. I hung one framed photo in my new office, not of Daniel, not of our wedding, but of my father, standing in front of the house he built with his own hands. The same house whose sale, decades later, funded a check that never made it into an envelope on a stage. There were mornings, in those first months, alone, when I woke up in a new apartment that didn't smell like him, and forgot for a few seconds where I was, reaching across a bed that had no one in it, before the whole weight of the last year came rushing back in. I went to therapy for the first time in my life, sat in a small office with a woman named Dr. Amara Chen, and told her, in our very first session, that I didn't know how to trust my own memory of my own marriage anymore, because if I'd been wrong about that, what else had I been wrong about? She told me something I've carried with me since. She said, "You weren't wrong to trust him, you were only wrong about who he'd become. Trusting someone isn't a character flaw. It's the thing that made those 14 good years actually good, even if the ending betrayed them." I didn't fully believe her the day she said it. I believe her now. I dated, eventually, though not for a long while, and not seriously for even longer after that. The first time a man reached for the check at dinner, I felt my whole body go rigid, waiting for some hidden condition to attach itself to the gesture. And it took me embarrassingly long to understand that not every kindness comes with a mailbox, rented 2 towns over. I forgave myself for that slowness. I think anyone would need it. I still think, sometimes, about those 3 seconds in the backyard. The ones where I stood completely still while a stranger in a gray suit told me my marriage, my home, my entire understood life, had quietly ended months earlier without anyone telling me. I think about how close I came to handing over everything I had to a man who had already decided I wasn't his to share it with. But I think more often about the 3 words that came after. Those 3 seconds, the ones that were entirely mine, the ones I didn't plan and didn't need to, because they were true the moment I said them. Those 3 words were the moment I stopped being a woman about to hand over her fortune and became a woman who took her whole life back instead. And if I've learned anything from that night, it's this. Sometimes the worst 3 seconds of your life are the exact 3 seconds that hand you back to yourself, if you're willing to walk back into the room and say what you actually mean. I don't hate Daniel anymore. I want to say that plainly. Because I think people expect the end of a story like mine to be about revenge, about watching someone burn and feeling warmed by the fire. It wasn't like that, not really. What I feel now, when his name comes up, is something closer to distance. The way you feel about a house you used to live in, after you've built a better one down the road. I drive past the old neighborhood sometimes, and I don't feel the ache I expected to feel. I feel grateful, oddly, for a stranger in a gray suit who whispered something true to me at exactly the moment I most needed to hear it, even though it broke my whole world open to do it. Some doors only close, so that you're forced to notice the one standing wide open right beside you. The one you'd stopped seeing, because you were too busy holding someone else's hand. I walked through mine. I'd walk through it again,